Welcome back. We are at the JPMorgan India Conference, and with me is Sajjid Chinoy, who is the Chief Asia Economic Research Head at JPMorgan. Sajjid, thank you very much for joining us on ET Now.
Morning.
To begin with, the India-US trade deal and the US tariff, the kind of impact that's happening is causing to the emerging markets. Where do you see emerging markets after this?
Yeah, I think it's good to start with emerging markets because I think they're going to be the real casualty of what's happening globally. I think there's a global reset that's ongoing, and I think there are three different forces to keep in mind. The first is, as you mentioned, U.S. tariffs have gone up. We're approaching the highest level since the 1930s. And if you look through all the daily noise and volatility, the effective rate in the U.S. should go up somewhere towards 17 or 18% based on the tariffs currently applied, right? And that would be significant protectionism from the world's largest economy, right? And I think the implication for emerging markets is, we sometimes underestimate how reliant emerging markets have been on export-led growth. If you draw a chart of emerging market ex-China growth over the last 25 years, and you draw a chart of global trade volumes, it's the same line, right? And so to the extent they've been so reliant on exports, the first question is, how do you generate export growth in this much more protectionist, much more economically balkanized global environment? That's just the first shock. The second shock is we're seeing a lot of excess capacity from China, right? And because the US has put on 40% tariffs on 42% on China, the worry is a lot of these exports will be redirected to other emerging markets in Asia, in India, but other ASEAN economies as well, Latin America, the Middle East, North Africa, for example. And so now emerging markets have to worry not just about export growth, but have to play defense at home because you want to protect your manufacturing sector from these cheap Chinese imports that are flooding in. And the third force that I sometimes refer to is, because of all the automation, and this is even before AI is fully kicked in, capital labor ratios in many emerging markets have increased very sharply. And that makes job creation hard. So I think the outlook for emerging markets is challenging because of these three forces: more protectionism, a China shock 2.0, except that this is directed at EMs, not at the US, right? And much more automation. And so you have to rethink and reinvent your growth models in this new environment.
And how India plays within this? Because we are more of a domestic-led economy, and our exports are just 1% of GDP.
True. So we are, I think, from a macroeconomic stability perspective, placed very well. I think over the last 10 or 11 years, in fact, going back all the way to 2013, there's been this institutionalization of macroeconomic stability since the taper tantrum. An inflation targeting framework, a large war chest of foreign currency reserves, a very credible fiscal framework, low external imbalances. So I think no reason to worry at all if there's global volatility. We've gone from being in the fragile five to being a safe haven economy. But I think on export, on growth, we should underestimate the role of exports in India's growth performance. Exports have been a key driver, even though they're 22% of GDP. They've been a key driver of growth over the last 3 decades. And I keep, my favorite statistic is only 13 economies in the world since the Second World War have grown at 7% or more for 25 years at a stretch, on average. India needs to emulate that. None of those economies were able to do it without export-led growth. So exports will have to be at the heart of any growth strategy, which is why I'm encouraged that, we've signed a deal with the UK, we are in advanced negotiations with the EU, and hopefully we can eventually sign a deal with the US. But I do think we have to kind of appreciate that exports have to be part of the growth strategy, even though we are, as you said, 60% or thereabouts consumption.
Yeah. The bigger issue is with respect to exports is that we are more dependent on exports for labor-intensive sectors.
Yes.
And it's not a capital good or goods, because services, yes, separate, we are there. But in the goods segment, it's more of a labor-intensive. Is there a way that we need to bring in policies within our country to change that?
No, quite the contrary. I mean, I think our endowment here is a lot of labor. So to create jobs, we actually want to boost labor-intensive exports even further, right? We've seen, for example, in services, service exports have surged over the last 4 or 5 years. That's created lots of white-collar jobs. So I think we need to replicate what's happened in the services story on the manufacturing front as well, and really leverage the fact that our comparative advantage is to have a lot of, labor, and how do we low-end manufacturing. Because China, as it moves towards more high-tech products, has actually creating a global vacuum in some of these labor-intensive sectors, textiles, leather, we've got some advantage in gems and jewelry, in footwear, plastics, rubber, toys. How does India gain a larger market share in labor-intensive sectors? Because that's going to be critical to job creation in India.
But if we are going to retain the labor-intensive sector, how are we going to create economies of scale or cost efficiencies to compete globally with other countries?
I think there's no tension there, because we've seen many countries, including in Bangladesh in recent years, where you just create large scale, right? So you have a lot of examples where you're in the labor-intensive sector, but because you're competing globally, your firms have reached economic scale. In fact, one of the advantages of being open and competing in the global market is A, your firms are forced to be more productive and efficient, and B, they're forced to reach certain levels of global scale. And I think from a reform perspective, it's important, therefore, to push ahead with the kind of foundational reforms on land, on labor in particular. We've seen the 4 labor codes have been passed in Parliament. It will be good if at some point they get implemented by the states, because that will allow firms to reach that optimal scale where they can effectively compete in the global market.
Circling back to the India-US trade deal, how do you see that playing out for the Indian economy or the GDP for this financial year?
So, I'm very hopeful and encouraged that negotiations are back on this week, and hopefully, some resolution can be found. I think, there's about 1% of GDP of India's value add that is exposed to the US, right? So you have to adjust for the sectors that don't face tariffs and adjust for import content. So it's about 1% of GDP. I think if the trade deal is concluded in a few weeks or a month or two, I think this will just be a blip. But one concern is that if we don't have a deal in the coming months, then you don't want a situation where a lot of small, medium enterprises in these sectors face concerns about economic viability, because that leads to challenges on employment and then the knock-on effect on consumption. Now, the good news is we have a playbook from COVID where there was a sudden demand shutdown. And so, to ensure that policy can provide a bridge to these firms to stay economically viable till any deal is concluded, and that will mean, regulatory forbearance, liquidity support, perhaps targeted surgical fiscal support, just to keep these sectors and enterprises viable, till a deal is concluded.
So, why do you think the government is not doing that?
I'm sure they are. I'm sure the governments.
They're waiting that if they do it and the deal happens, they may not have to. Reverse the thing.
No. So I think I'm sure that that is something that the government is thinking about very closely and will do at the appropriate time. We've already had a GST cut, which should hopefully boost demand on the other hand. But I think, and that certainly, and we should talk about the supports to consumption in India.
That was my next thing.
Right. But I think, surgical support in these sectors, if the negotiations take longer, may be useful from an economic viability perspective.
Do you think that negotiations can be concluded by November, at least the phase 1? Because we took at least 2 years to complete the UK deal, and EU has been in works for at least a year and a half, which is there.
That really depends on how the US team approaches this. We've seen in the case of the US, a fair amount of capriciousness with other countries as well.
Very volatile in that.
Very volatile. So hopefully, given the experience of the last 6 months, that now both sides are much closer. So I always, I'm an old school trade economist in the sense that trade is not a zero-sum game, right? It's a positive-sum game. You can have a win-win on both sides, and hopefully that's where the trade negotiations will go towards.
A recent statement from government also mentioned that our biggest trade deficits are from the BRICS countries. How do you plan to bridge that as well? Because within the BRICS, we have the highest deficits across.
So I'm not sure deficits necessarily are bad, because I think by that logic, what the US is doing is also correct, right? Ultimately, a trade deficit or trade imbalance or a current account imbalance is simply the investment savings gap of an economy. And when you're a developing market, the capital flows that you get is the inverse of the current account deficit. So running a sustainable current account deficit, 2% of GDP, 2.5% of GDP, is not a bad thing because it allows you to attract foreign capital and the technology that comes with it to augment your domestic savings, right? And I think, again, so I don't worry about individual bilateral deficits, which is why I think the approach the US is following, this very mercantilist approach that, you need imbalances to go to zero, in my mind, doesn't square.
Well, that's extreme ends, basically, in that sense. But how do you see in this whole picture of domestic consumption? Because we've seen the government looking at tax cuts, the RBI cutting, doing a front loading of cuts there, and then you have the GST cut which came into being.
Exactly.
So all three coming into, do you think that that's enough to boost capital, to push the person across to the retail and say that, okay, now you buy?
I would go even beyond that. I think there are 5 mutually reinforcing factors that should help private consumption in the coming months and quarters, some of which we've already begun to see. First, we've got record low inflation this year, right? So inflation for this full fiscal year should average 2.5%.
And
right?
that's below RBI's projection as well.
Projection, and RBI is close, I think at 2.9 or thereabouts, or 3%. But I think what that does is low inflation, it just boosts purchasing power for households, right? Number one. Number two, we've had another very strong monsoon, right? And that should help the agricultural sector. And the combination of the strong monsoon and low inflation is already helping rural consumption to pick up. What's been very encouraging in the last, 6 months is you've seen clear signs that rural demand and rural consumption is picking up. In addition to that, there are 3 more factors, right? And as I said, the monetary easing that the RBI has undertaken, that's working its way through the system. Lending rates on fresh loans have come off. You've just begun to see credit growth on a sequential perspective pick up. So the transmission is
10% for the first time.
right. And I think if you look at the sequential growth month on month, that's encouraging. So you've just begun to see monetary policy kick in. Don't forget we had direct tax cuts in the February budget, right? And we now have indirect tax cuts, right? So there are these 5 factors: low inflation, a strong monsoon, monetary easing, direct tax cuts, indirect tax cuts, all reinforcing each other. So I'm very hopeful that, consumption in the coming quarters will pick up. And that's important because from a private investment perspective, what firms will need in this environment of heightened uncertainty globally is demand visibility. And so the demand is not coming from the export front, at least in the near term, and it comes from the consumption front. It'll help hopefully offset each other. So the next few quarters are important, but I'm very hopeful that all of these supports on consumption that reinforce each other will cause a revival in consumption going forward.
That will bring in the urban consumption back? Because if you look at the last policy of RBI and they do the future expectation, there we saw the index going below 100 to 96.5 or so. So it's
many of these factors should help urban consumption, right? So urban consumption tends to be more leveraged, and so to the extent that lending rates are lower and credit growth is picking up, that should help the urban sector. Clearly, to the extent that the urban sector has bought a lot of consumer durables, the GST cuts will help the urban sector, right? The direct tax cuts should help. So I'm hopeful that at some point urban begins to recover as well and reinforces what's happening on rural.
Tax cuts and direct and indirect tax cuts, that's going to put some pressure on the fisc. The government is expecting that the buoyancy will, take care of the revenue fall or foregone as part of the cuts. Do you think that's good enough? There will be a good enough buoyancy which will take care of this?
There are a lot of moving parts, and we're still early in the year. We're only in September, so we're just 6 months into the fiscal year. We've also seen non-tax revenues pick up, right? I think the key here will be that if growth begins to inflect in the coming quarters, then you should get, both real growth picking up and hopefully buoyancy picks up in the coming months. Also, a lot will depend on what we economists call the kind of Laffer curve of taxes. That with direct tax cuts coming down, will volumes pick up to offset that? So, I think that's an issue that the government will have to confront in the last quarter. At this point, we should just hope that that growth begins to inflect or gets a bigger push from these recent moves.
So where do you see RBI by the end of this fiscal? How many cuts are you seeing from the RBI?
I think right now the central bank has the luxury to wait. They have front-loaded in the October policy meeting. Our call is that there'll be a hold. And I think the logic is simple, that they've front-loaded 100 basis points of easing. The last GDP number was stronger than had been expected.
And some people have questions on how it is happening.
Well, and from a monetary policy perspective, fiscal policy has now kicked into action, right? And the uncertainty that the RBI confronts is very binary. If we have a trade deal in a month's time, then those external headwinds will dissipate. And the focus will be very much on the domestic support. So I think of the economy the next quarter as being external headwinds from the US, tariffs, in a tug of war with all these consumption support. So if the trade deal is struck in the next month, the outlook will improve meaningfully. So I think the RBI may well choose to say we've done a lot already. Monetary has moved, fiscal has now moved. We have the luxury to wait until December. By December, we'll have a much greater sense of where we are on the trade negotiations. Has some deal struck? And if at that point more support is required, I think inflation is benign enough. Base effects will push up inflation in the first half of next year. But if you look at the underlying momentum, it's still very benign, right? And so inflation is benign enough that if the RBI needs to use monetary policy in the coming months, it has the space. But I think right now it perhaps will retain the option value of waiting.
How do you see earnings playing out here? Because in the entire thing, what we have seen over the last 6 to 8 quarters, there has been a raw material inflation. At some point, they were able to push because the raw material prices are going down, so they were able to absorb that or manage that. But then in the last 2 quarters, we've seen the inflation getting into the P&L as well, where the margins started contracting for many of them. So, and now with the GST cut, and there are some issues with respect to ITC and other stuff, but how does it play out?
Well, which is why top line growth will matter a lot, right? That one can't be at the mercy of just expecting input costs to go down, and that's why what we spoke about, which is that if consumption begins to pick up, right, and you get some animal spirits on the consumption side, and that boosts top line growth in the next few quarters, I think that is what should help earnings pick up. But let's be realistic here, because I think this is a year where nominal GDP growth is going to be close, between 8 and 9%.
Much below 10%.
Right. So if nominal GDP growth is 8 to 9%, you have to re-anchor all the nominal variables in the economy, right? If you're at 9% nominal GDP growth, the earnings number that we should be forecasting should be linked to that.
Yes.
The credit growth number that we should be forecasting should be linked to that, right?
What should be the multiplier?
Well, it depends. I mean, in credit, most people say, in past cycles, about 1.2% has been a sustainable kind of multiplier on that. But, earnings, credit, tax collections, GST collections, all of that should be relative to where we are on nominal GDP growth. So even if you don't get numbers which are in the high teens or the mid-teens, it's not surprising, because if nominal GDP is around 9, everything else has to work off that base.
So you think